is unclarity over the Strait of Hormuz, pushing the world toward economic collapse. Washington says oil is flowing and markets are quickly recovering, but others say this is only the beginning of a once-in-a-lifetime energy crisis, driving us all toward despair. I'll be asking three economists just how bad it could get. I'm Andrea Sankian. Today's newsmaker is the global economy. Upon signing some kind of deal with Iran last week, President Trump said, "Ships of the world, start your engines, let the oil flow." The markets rallied in response, but just hours later, Iran announced the Strait of Hormuz was still closed. At best, ships are starting to trickle through. It marks welcome progress after 4 months in which the entire planet felt the ramifications of the Strait's chokehold on global energy and production supplies. Still, some economists are warning that the fallout will not subside once the Strait fully reopens, but instead will manifest over years, leading us to a potential global economic collapse. Here's a look at the conditions we could face.
As negotiators work to build on the US-Iran framework agreement, each diplomatic breakthrough has been followed by uncertainty over whether it can actually be implemented. Mediators say both sides have agreed to move forward toward a broader deal. But outside the negotiating room, the picture is far less clear. Washington said the agreement paves the way for the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz and the return of Iranian oil exports. Markets have welcomed the prospect of easing disruptions to global energy supplies. The strait carries around a fifth of the world's oil trade. Its effective closure over the past 4 months forced producers to shut in millions of barrels of daily output, disrupted LNG exports, and reshaped global supply chains. The International Energy Agency estimates that more than 14 million barrels a day of oil production remain offline. For some economists, the agreement may have created a diplomatic breakthrough. Whether it can reverse 4 months of economic disruption is a far more difficult question.
It'll take months to clear the ships in the Gulf. It'll take months to years to rebuild some of the facilities that have been damaged. The economic impact is still to come because we haven't yet experienced the hole in the supply chain from the Gulf that we knew was coming, because with the closure of the Gulf, rather than 100+ ships getting through a day, it's been of the order of less than 10, substantially less than 10 ships getting through per day for 3 months. And that means that we have run down the stocks.
But not everyone believes the damage will be as severe. Some argue markets are looking beyond today's disruption and focusing instead on how quickly production could return once the agreement begins to take effect.
Across the GCC, the Arab Gulf states, there's quite some damage, but not considerable. I think there is, in some places, we will see a V-shaped recovery where more or less the taps will open again. In others where you had a throttling of production, this will take much longer for these oil wells to kind of recover to full strength in terms of output. Some of the refineries were hit, nothing too big when it comes to the oil industry.
The recovery now depends on the next phase of negotiations. The future of Iran's nuclear program, the scope of sanctions relief, and the long-term return of Iranian oil to global markets remain under negotiation, with both sides working towards a final agreement within 60 days. Until then, much of the economic uncertainty that has weighed on global markets is unlikely to disappear. The framework agreement has eased fears of another immediate shock, but restoring confidence to the global economy may take considerably longer.
Well, joining me now to take an in-depth look at the potential for economic disaster are from Amsterdam. The Economist featured in our report there, who described the current conditions as a once-in-a-lifetime energy crisis, Steve Keen. From Zurich, Economist and former member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council For Energy Security, Cornelia Meyer, and from Washington, Director of Tax Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, Michel. Thanks all so much for being with me. Really, there is so much to consider here, and the details, I know they matter, but I'm going to start kind of big and broad. So Steve Keen, we'd heard repeated mention of, hitting a point of no return, whereby the economic damage caused by stopping not just the flow of energy, but of production supplies, as well as fertilizer, if it stopped for too long, it would not be recovered from without massive fallout and damage first. So have we hit that point?
It's not quite with us, but it's arriving probably in the next couple of weeks, because what we have with something like the Strait of Hormuz and tankers moving supplies from that from the strait to the rest of the world, it takes up to 3 months for one of those boats to make it from where it is to where it's needed, and that means that in the meantime, you still have ships which were sailing from the strait before the war, before the blockage began, before the ridiculous war started. So that they are running out. So we now have the flow of goods has been stopped, and the question of how long is that flow stop covered by existing stocks? Because if you don't have new flow coming in, then you can use your existing stocks. But of course, you start running them down. That's been going on for coming up to 3 months now, and it is quite likely that we're starting to see the crunch point, the loss of 10% of oil and natural gas supplies, 30% of fertilizer, 50% of helium and sulfuric acid. That is all about to hit us, and quite possibly in the next couple of weeks.
Oh, so I mean, Steve, what kind of world are we looking at in the third and fourth quarter of 2026 and then 2027?
Well, you may know the old medieval torture, which was called the death by 1,000 cuts. You didn't sever an artery, but you severed so many things the body fell apart and died. We're not going to die as a result of this, but we are going to see just how dependent we are upon supplies that we took for granted right up until this crisis occurred. They always thought the oil would flow. Skeptics about global warming would say the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. But now we can also say the Strait of Hormuz doesn't always flow. And we're suddenly realizing how many absolutely critical production components come out of that strait, and without them, we can't produce an enormous range of goods and services, from food at one extreme to microchips at the other. So we are going to really see how fragile the global economy is when we've spent the last half century believing it's robust.
Okay. Adam, I'm wondering what you make of that analysis over at the Cato Institute, because President Trump keeps saying the markets, they're doing great, and that is proof of the resilience of the economy. But what does that mean in real terms? Are stock markets really the best indicator of economic health?
There's certainly one indicator. There's many more that are also important, but I think the bigger story here is not this particular crisis. It is the fact that over the last 6 years we've hit a series of unforeseen shocks. We had the pandemic, and then inflation that was high of the last multiple decades. We have the war in Ukraine, and now the war in Iran, and the closing of the strait. And the story here is one of resilience. Certainly, there are high costs, and none of these things can be forecasted with any certainty. And the longer they go on, the larger the costs. But I do think that pulling back, the story is one of resilience, one of economic actors adapting to very tough situations. And so we don't want to underestimate the power of markets to find ways around stupid policies that are inflicted upon them by governments all around the world.
Okay, so you don't necessarily have the most positive outlook, but you say really the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz isn't the core of the problem necessarily, that it started from much further back. Then, Cornelia, I'll come to you in 1 second, but Steve, let me ask you first, because you've indicated that the markets really are a problem, in part because, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you feel they're basically being manipulated, and that Trump's, I think, pump and dump habits, as you've called them, really put the world economy in danger because of how the stock market is being managed and, yeah, played behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons that economists can't see the scale of damages that are coming out of this is that economists pretend that you can produce output by combining labor and capital and what they call technology in a factory, and bang, goods come out the other end. That's how simplistic economic theory is. In the real world, you need a range of critical inputs to make outputs. You need iron ore to make steel, for example, simple example. But you need energy to make literally everything. And when you take a look at the relationship between change in energy supplies and change in gross world product, the correlation is virtually 100%. If energy goes up 6%, GDP goes up 6%. If gross world product goes down by 4%, energy goes down by the same amount. They are absolutely lockstep. Now, that implies that if we lose 10% of the energy supplies of the planet, we lose 10% of GDP. And there's nothing markets can do about that, because it isn't markets that produce output, it's factories. And if factories don't have those inputs, especially the most critical one of energy, they can't produce the output in the same scale. And that means whatever the prices get to, you're going to have to wear a 10% fall in the level of physical goods being produced. We won't necessarily have that larger scale of fall. There is a bit of adaptability, but nowhere near as much of economists have fooled themselves into believing actually happens.
Okay. You know, Cornelia, okay, everyone at every level wants energy prices to come down. But the problem is, and I think you've said this yourself, that energy prices will have to stay elevated to a certain point because there's still the issue of getting the ships to flow fully again with security, and the insurers that need to insure these ships, knowing how precarious this so-called deal is and stability in the Gulf actually is.
Well, yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Andrea. And what we see here is that, as Steve rightly pointed out, there's a difference between markets and the real economy, and this truth, so whatever it is, that did not come 1 second too early, because we've lived on borrowed barrels, which we've used the inventories, official and state inventories, private inventories, and they're reaching tank bottom, and once that's gone, there's no more to go around. So yes, that's true, the ships need to go there in the wrong place, and what I say, the litmus test is not the ships leaving the Strait of Hormuz. The litmus test is how many ships will have the courage to go into the Strait of Hormuz, to fill up again and go out again. Now, Rystad Energy says we will, if we're lucky, we will get to 85% by the fourth quarter of this year, and back to 100% of where we were by the first quarter of next year. We also need to see this is not just about oil, it's also about fertilizer. And when I look especially at the global south, where the planting season is imminent, they're sort of priced out of the market. Even if they can get their hands on it, they're priced out of the market. So there is, as Steve rightly said, there is more to it than just oil. There's all these critical inputs to the supply chain, and especially agriculture. We can live without a lot, but we cannot live without food.
Yeah, I've heard estimates, Steve, I think you said there are minimum 10 to about 20 countries actually facing proper famine conditions based on what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. But I need to come back to Adam quickly, because Adam, you know, you talked about what happened prior to the crisis in the Strait, and given that, there are these questions surrounding the health of the U.S. economy itself. Debt to GDP is above 120%. U.S. Treasury bonds have lost a lot of their appeal to many. So that should, I'm not an economist, but should that not push interest rates up? And instead, you now have a regime that is insisting rates come down. So how do you make sense of U.S. economic policy going forward? Because it's key to how the globe recovers.
You're exactly right. The United States government policy is making recovery and resilience to these types of shocks that much harder. We can't forecast the next the next economic shock that comes from a war or a pandemic or something unforeseen by definition. But we can forecast the slow crises that are rolling towards us, like the U.S. federal government and similar tendencies around the world of governments to spend significantly more than they take in, accumulating large annual deficits and even larger accumulated debts. The same problem you see in the regulatory front. The United States, it doesn't have the worst of regulatory accumulation, but around the world, especially across Europe, one of the major things holding back resilience and adaptability is the accumulation of regulatory burdens. And you can see this in the divergence between the US and the European Union. If you go back to pre-COVID trends, the European Union is about 20% below their trend, where the US is about 20% above. And a lot of that can be explained by the role of government intervening in markets, making it harder to adapt and grow out of these challenges. And so you're certainly right. I think the biggest risks that we should be focusing on are those ones that are easy to forecast, and that's growing debt and regulatory accumulation.
Okay, Steve, hold your thoughts. Cornelia, I know you had a comment. Do go ahead.
Yes, and I think one of the things we have to look at, you mentioned interest rates. Yes, on one hand, if you have inflation, they ought to go up because the central banks have targets of 2%. On the other hand, if your economy goes into recession, you have to have them come down in order to induce investment and so on. So it's really difficult to be a central banker. And on the debt, I think Steve's absolutely right. But I look especially at the US. And when I take not just the public debt, but also the private debt that we are holding, the OECD world is woefully over leveraged.
But Cornelia, you are alluding to the phenomenon of stagflation, correct me if I'm wrong, which is really the worst of both worlds that we're going to be looking at?
Well, yes. If we look at it, we have another country that we haven't mentioned, which is incredibly important to the world, which is China, the world's second largest economy, and they're currently battling stagflation. The Chinese economy is not doing too well, and we do need the Chinese economy to do well.
Okay, Steve, I'm wondering what you think of that. If you want to comment, go ahead quickly, but I do have a very important question to ask you as well about the US dollar. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm going to completely disagree with Adam on the level of government debt and completely agree with Cornelia on the level of private debt. Mainstream economists obsess about the level of government debt and completely ignore private debt. In fact, when you understand financial dynamics, the opposite applies. Private debt is dangerous, government debt is not. And with a high level of private debt, what is happening with this crisis is people's capacity to service that debt is being damaged by the damage to the production system. So rather than having a financial crisis like 2008, when there was too much credit causing a bubble and then a crash afterwards, what we have now is a high level of private debt, higher than it should be, hit by an inability to service that debt out of income because you won't have the sulfuric acid to make the copper, you won't have the helium to make the ships, you won't have workers will lose their jobs as well. So many people are going to have their financial viability challenged as a result of this. And I know that conventional economists have no idea that this is what's happening because they ignore private debt. They simply can't see the possibility of private bankruptcy. Instead, they fantasize about government bankruptcies, which will never happen to a country that produces its own currency and issues debt in its own currency.
Okay, Steve, I'm going to stick with you because I wanted to get in. Oh, okay, Adam, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think this is exactly the distinction that needs to be made, is that governments can't go insolvent. So they are going to end up printing money in order to cover their debts, creating additional inflation and putting more stress on the private sector. The private debt may or may not be a problem for those people that have taken it on, but at least it's being invested in what ostensibly could be productive resources. And the failure is one that impacts those people that have taken bets on those investments, instead of an institution that is spending other people's money and often spending that money on things that are not raising productivity and aren't making everyone else better off.
Cornelia, quickly, does that make sense to you?
Well, no, it doesn't make sense to me in the sense that I am actually not that certain that governments can't go bankrupt. Yes, if you're the United States and you print dollars, yes. If I look at a lot of the emerging economies, they can where they have so much debt outstanding, to other countries that they very much can go. They can become insolvent, and as always, that the weakest are hurt the most with this crisis, as with every other crisis.
Steve, then let me come back to you because you have made issue with the potential weakening of the US dollar. And I want to ask you about this because after the September 11th attacks and then the Iraq War, I remember hearing very similar doom forecasts for the US dollar that weren't weakened, that didn't weaken at that point. Then, even after the US created the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis disaster, still nothing significant really happened to the US dollar. But you seem to be kind of convinced that the conditions are different now and that the US is also facing a currency value crisis.
Yeah, I think it is because America has been running a trade deficit for 40 years. That trade deficit has undermined its capacity to invest in its own manufacturing sector. It's fallen behind dramatically compared, obviously, to China, but also most of the rest of the world. There's still strong manufacturing in the States, but nothing like what it had in the 50s and 60s. And I think at the same time, what America has done, America turns everything into a weapon. It turned its currency into a weapon. It said Iran couldn't use the SWIFT system. All these sorts of things, America used it to attack other people, but the response of other people is other countries to say, we have to find an alternative mechanism then. So that's what's happening. I think that's bringing down the significance of the American dollar dominating global trade. We're finding countries doing bilateral exchanges with their own currencies rather than passing through the SWIFT system. All this stuff, I don't think the American dollar will necessarily die now, but its preeminence is over. And I think that is going to mean that America finds that having weaponized the dollar, the main person who that shot in the foot was the American economy.
Cornelia, go ahead.
Yes, I think you are absolutely right. I wouldn't say the preeminence is over, but it reduced. And you are right in as much as if you weaponize the dollar and if you use it for sanctions, we see it used to be the petrodollar, remember? And now a lot of the transactions, the biggest importer of oil is China, and a lot of the transactions, not just from Iran, not just from Russia, also from Gulf countries, is paid in yuan or in other currencies. So yes, the preeminence is not over, but it's significantly weakened.
Okay, Adam, did you disagree there?
Yeah.
Maybe a disagreement in scale. I certainly think that the economic problems in the United States, rising government debt, the use of our currency to extract things from other countries in a heavy-handed way makes it a less attractive ultimate destination. But it really comes down to a beauty contest with other currencies around the world. And unfortunately for the United States, is the prettiest of all the ugly ducklings, and people keep lending us money, giving us that rope to hang ourselves with, which is what allows us to accumulate these large debts and deficits and not fix our fiscal problems. And so I wish public markets would discipline United States policymakers a little bit more so that we could actually get our fiscal house in order, which would ultimately be better for the United States and make it and ensure that the dollar remains the sort of safest currency in the world, which should be a reflection of good policy, not just the fact that everyone else has worse policy.
But Steve, for you, the free markets just aren't the answer. They can't be in this case.
Well, I would rather discipline economists because, frankly, it's economists who've got us into this trap by not understanding how the monetary system functions. All this stuff about too much government debt, et cetera, et cetera. If you understand the double entry bookkeeping that is the basis of how money is created, then you realize that there are two ways that money are created in domestic economies. Banks create money by credit, so banks create money by lending more than they take back in repayments, and the government creates money by spending more than it takes back in taxation revenue. So if the government doesn't run a deficit, it doesn't create fiat money, and you have an economy entirely based on credit money. Now, that is actually more unstable than a system which has a mix of credit and fiat money to it. Reducing the level of government debt, for example, the last time it was done on a grand scale was in the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge reduced government debt from 30% of GDP to 15% of GDP and argued that's what caused the boom of the 1920s. He said it should be maintained indefinitely. What happened next? The Great Depression. Because while Coolidge was watching government debt fall by 1% of GDP per annum, the private sector was increasing debt by 5% of GDP per annum. Then when the private sector stopped borrowing money for the speculative bubble of the stock market in 1929, the whole economy crashed. And people were doing, it was a debt deflation. And in that situation, the only thing that can get you out of it, and I know this from mathematical analysis of complex systems, the only thing that can get you out is government spending. So all the arguments that economists are doing are recreating the conditions for 1929. The one thing that stops the situation being as bad as then is that the government is now roughly 10 times the size it was during the 1920s. And because of that scale and because there are so many non-discretionary elements to government spending, when the private sector has a downturn, the government spending boosts and attenuates the downturn. But what economists are doing are basically pulling away the supports for a complex system they do not understand.
There's so much more I'd like to ask all three of you about, but so unfortunately we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with me, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.